we're here. Wonderful. Okay, we're going to dive right in. This is a shorter session. It's only an hour. So we'll make ample use of the time that we have, and we'll try to turn things over to you guys for questions like we did last time. Real quick administrative update. I know, Shai, you're pretty good about asking questions in the Maven online questions area. That's a really awesome place to ask questions if they come up during the week, or if you have questions during or after the course that you want to have answered. So I'll be trying to go through those once a week before Monday to help answer questions. I know it was a little bit late. I only gave you like an hour to look at it today, but in the future, I'll try to answer it like on a Thursday or Friday. That way you guys can have some time to digest, and then we can riff on it a bit more. Cool with that. We're going to jump in today. We have an amazing schedule lined up for this week. First, you're going to talk about the importance of a CRM. Obviously, a CRM is kind of like the most, besides the CDP, I would say CDP and CRM are the two most important parts of a B2B or B2B2C technology stack. We'll talk a little bit about what it means to buy a right CRM or to build a right CRM in the early days. This is generally going to flow into a much deeper discussion around like, what does it actually look like to build a stack at different stages of a company's life cycle? And then we're actually going to switch a little bit and talk about attribution. These two are related because often what happens is as you start to put tools in place to help your company grow, you typically get into this place where you say, okay, we're collecting leads, we're driving revenue, but now where does it come from? And this evolves kind of in a cyclical scale as you grow. You'll get more leads, and you got to figure out where they come from. You get more leads, you figure out where they come from. And Pranav will tell you all about how to save yourself a lot of pain. I have my own opinions based on experience, but I'm excited to hear his. And then we'll go from there. But before we get started, really quick, want to introduce Pranav. Do you want to just intro yourself, Pranav?
Yeah, happy to. Hey, everyone. I am Pranav. And yeah, you can read all about me on this slide, so I will spare you the details. I'll just give you the highlights of my career. Computer science major who became a product manager, who then became a marketer, found my calling in life, and then decided to start a company to solve the biggest problem that marketers have, and that is attribution. So that's what I do today, and that's why Austin decided it might be fun to hear me talk and wax poetic about attribution. So that's
Thank
me.
you. Yeah. And Pranav is a customer at Clarify, but we also just got to share a lot of time together, just coming from one of our portfolio investors. And Pranav is based in San Francisco Bay Area. And one thing I like to ask all the people who come on the course, Pranav, is so obviously where you live. What's something you do for fun outside of work, if you have any free
Oh,
time right now?
good question. Two hobbies. One is teaching my two girls everything that there is to learn at their ages. So they're 5 and 8. So this weekend was, learning how to bike with my 5-year-old, and the other is watching Warriors games, which was awesome yesterday because they won against the Rockets. I was nervous, so it was fun.
Love it. Love it. Cool. We're going to dive in. We have about 20 minutes of upfront lecture. Feel free to ask questions like y'all normally do. Jump in if you want. Chris and Ben are here to field questions as well. Chris may be a little bit delayed, which is why we have Ben. He's dealing with an electrician. And I feel like that's just any homeowners in the group will know that's just like the balance of life is that you own this home, and then every single month it seems like you have to bring a contractor in to fix some bullshit in the house, and you're like, great, you give me a 6-hour window in the middle of the day to come fix some stupid thing. I deeply empathize with that experience. It literally happened to me last week. So prayers to you, Chris. Okay, so let's jump right in. We're going to talk about tooling to start. We talked a little bit about this last time, but there are 3 core technologies that can underpin, or I would say underpin, a marketing and revenue technology system. There's obviously a CDP, which is to manage what we're calling interactions. You can think of this in more technical terms as events. You have a CRM, which helps consolidate some of that data alongside customer interaction records. And you have warehouses, which are to store all that data in a raw format for reporting, analysis, and a lot of other stuff. So I think it's important to talk for a second about CDPs and CRM because it's surprising to me how many experienced marketers I still have asking the question of what's the difference between the two. And I actually think it's deeply rooted in a very simple concept, which is related to their schema. If you don't know what schema is, you can think of schema as the columns in an Excel table. This describes the data that you're looking at. So for example, if you were trying to think about your entire go-to-market system in an Excel table, you might have an Excel table that has people. You might have an Excel table that has companies. And you might also have an Excel table that tracks what people do on your website, your app, or if you have a product that's offline in a store. For example, at Walmart, you would have customer interactions happening in a store, in an offline setting, and you have customer interactions happening online, in an actual app or website. Now, those actions, clicking on a website button, checking out, buying a tool, performing something inside the app, those are all called events. These are things that people perform. And a great way to think of it is marketers, especially performance marketers, care a lot about those actions because it helps tell them who is performing in the app, who could be performing in the app, and and how to track those people. So that's what lives in a CDP. If you're thinking about that table, that schema, actions that people take, that is CDP land. Usually you track people and the actions they perform. Now, this is related very closely to what a CRM tracks. CRM is tracking people as well. It's also tracking companies, and it's also tracking this thing called opportunities or deals. The big difference between a CDP and a CRM is that a CDP is really designed to track what actions people are taking on a website or application. A CRM is really intended to track the activities that a company is taking to close a deal or generate some revenue value for a company. They're related in the sense, though, that you have people at the core performing actions. And obviously we can visualize this. CRMs are kind of the core of a revenue technology stack in the same way as CDP is the core of a marketing technology stack. This is our stack, which I showed briefly last time. Even as a 20 person company that was founded last year, we have a lot of tools in our stack. We have a CDP to track when people go to clarify.ai. We have a CDP to track when people are performing events inside of our product. And that information is actually translated both into our warehouse and to our CRM. Our CRM, which is ourself, of course, is where we're tracking people, what activities we're performing against them, opportunities or deals, and all the like. So let's shift gears for a second and talk about CRM specifically. And I'm going to try not to make this a over-branded sales pitch for Clarify. So if it's starting to annoy you at any point, call it my bullshit in the chat channel. I think a CRM is like the most important thing to understand inside of a RevTech stack. So we got to cover it for a little bit, but I don't want this to be an egregious sales pitch. I want to talk though about some of like the problems that I've heard, and then we'll frame them in terms of what does it mean for you. So these are just like some snippets of of obviously people echoing to the Twitter sphere. Lack of flexibility, not helpful in daily operations, cumbersome, inaccurate data. But honestly, the thing that I hear the most often, the two most common things I hear complaints about, and I've interviewed, 100, 200 people on CRMs. The first is that it's overly complex. Hey, I understand the core concepts of CRM, but I just wish it wasn't so hard. Anybody who's used Salesforce or HubSpot knows that that complexity comes down to how many button clicks it actually takes to do something. This is a common problem with all enterprise features, not just CRMs, but as the complexity grows, if you don't pay a lot of attention to how you're managing that complexity, things become hard because they require more button clicks, which requires more time. So that's the number one complaint. Second biggest complaint is actually has nothing to do with the products, but has everything to do with the revenue, how they bill for people. In particular, large organizations and small organizations hate the idea of seat-based pricing because it says, hey, I can only use the tool as much as I'm willing to pay for a person. And so you get into all these schemes around people trying to share seats and all this other bullshit. So those are the two biggest complaints that I hear why people want to use alternative CRMs. And we're sitting here talking about CRM, there's really only two major competitors that people think about at the enterprise level. There's Salesforce and HubSpot. And then there are a variety of other tools along that pathway, though. And I think a question that I often get from folks who are building rev stacks is, hey, when do I adopt to something like HubSpot and Salesforce? Should I do it early or later? I know that I need to get there eventually, but how do I get there? And I think there's largely been an area of practice that says, hey, well, if I'm going to get there eventually, why not do it now? And I'm here to tell you that most of the people who I meet that do that end up regretting it, because buying a tool that you'll need in 5 years for the problems you have today is not a really good practice. Not even among CRM, but like any tool. If it's like, I know one day I'm going to be a rock star triathlete, so let me go buy a $20,000 triathlon bike. It's like, okay, no, that's a great way to get divorced in my book. So times are changing. So we used to have these clunky databases. And when I talk about databases, I'm particularly talking about, Salesforce in this case. I don't necessarily think HubSpot is that clunky. Salesforce is actually architected 20 years ago. And so there are some functional limitations to how they store data. And the simplest way to think of it is when we talked before about a CDP and a CRM, much of the way that Salesforce in particular, and I'm sorry to pick on them, because HubSpot doesn't necessarily have this problem, but Salesforce in particular is structured in a way to not allow you to collect event data. You have to use a completely separate product for it. It's not integrated. It's not easy. Don't believe what people tell you. The hype is not real. They do not allow you to collect event data in the same way that something like HubSpot would. So you get into this problem where you have a CRM and a CDP. They can't talk the same language. This is the reason why a lot of times you have these arrows that diverge across the stack map, and you have backflows of data from something like the warehouse into a CRM because they can't actually store that data. Likewise, I think people are chasing after workflow automation that's easy. So something like a list management tool inside HubSpot, forecasting and reporting, even schema management. You can think of on top of a CRM, there are probably 15 to 20 different capabilities that exist around the ecosystem. And I think what happens is you buy a CRM or even a CDP, and you have to kind of provide those capabilities in suite with the main tool. And over time, if you're not kind of thinking carefully about how to integrate those tools, it becomes complex and hard to manage. Likewise, there's also some basic expectations that I think people are starting to have from their tooling. Like, can you get meeting prep? Can you get call prep? Can you get analytics? Can you get enrichment all inside of one particular piece of software? And so this kind of brings us to like the meat of today's conversation, which is that CRM needs, and I would actually argue all tool needs, can evolve over time. So you can start with a tool and you can admit to yourselves that, hey, this might not be the right tool for forever, but it's the right tool for today. This happened to us really, we have some strong opinions on the team about building an onboarding tool, or onboarding flow for our customers to come into the product and be able to activate on the product quickly. We can customize the UI. We have a lot of control over when it shows and when it doesn't. But that level of effort is going to be probably 2 to 3 weeks. Whereas buying a tool that maybe is not the tool for forever is a day of work. And so that's a trade-off we're willing to make now to say, hey, we know this is not going to be the right tool for forever, but it's the right tool for today. And we can reevaluate as the company grows, is this going to be the same tool or the right tool for us over time? Now, I know this maybe is inducing an allergic reaction to a lot of folks, because you come to a team and I think the instinct is to say, oh, well, we want to pick the best tool and the right tool to last us forever. And I think in the enterprise or the scale version of the world, yes, you're making those decisions. You're not thinking just about today. You're thinking about 10 years down the road. But I would argue if you're not in the scale phase, you're still in growth or anything before, you still have the ability to change over time. And that's kind of the expectation I've seen of most of the companies I work for, is that you're not going to actually have the ability to make those scaled decisions until later. So you should think about your company and the tools and the choices you make in terms of gates, right? So now let's talk a little bit about what to look for in a CRM. And again, I'm going to generalize this a bit to talk about all types of tools, because I think it largely applies, but this will be focused on CRM particularly just to get through this. So the first is traditional CRM responsibilities. This is the basic stuff. I think even if you're a startup with 3 people in it, you have some very basic needs. You need to collect contacts. You need the ability to create leads. You need the ability to track opportunities or deals. And you eventually need the ability to manage a pipeline. This is the most common use case among every founder, startup, Series A company I talk to is, I have people in a deal pipeline, I need to manage it. The ways that people typically start this process is through a Google Sheet or Notion. And then when they realize that they can't keep all the context inside their brain, they start searching for tools. The next is kind of, I would say, a step higher, which is activity logging, communication, and workflows. So once you move past the stage of, hey, I have 20 or 30 things in my head to I have 50 to 100 things or 100 to 500 things, then the activity history becomes really important so that people can start collaborating on a revenue cycle. Likewise, I would actually say that workflows don't become important until, again, you cross that 50 to 100 person threshold, where 50 to 100 people in your deal tracking management software. And I put AI intelligence here. I'll be honest, I think like even the word AI intelligence is kind of maybe overrated. Like we even struggle to use it ourselves as a provider of this technology. Like what is AI intelligence? I think what people are really looking for is automation. They're looking for the ability to automate away the tedious parts of their job. And so what I would say there is I think, this is not just about Clarify. There are some interesting tools out there that are thinking about how do we take the parts of related CRM technology and integrate them right inside the app. A great example is like there's a tool called Default that does call scheduling and routing for inbound leads. And they bake in enrichment and schema management and some other tools. And this is the same thing for another tool I know called Unify. It's kind of the same approach that we're taking. There's this idea, though, that, hey, CRMs of the past, and particularly Salesforce, relied a lot on an ecosystem network where you would integrate everything alongside of Salesforce, and there was power and control at the CRM layer by having these other integrated systems. The challenge with that, though, is one, over time, it becomes very expensive. You have a different tool for pretty much every different capability in your stack. That means you're paying $20, $30, $100,000 per tool set. At Ramp, this is the reason why our CRM stack cost $2-3 million. And then likewise, it leads to the problem that we've already talked about, which is you have lots of data flows going in different directions between these tools. How do you control them? So when I say AI intelligence, what I think I really mean by this and what I would start to pick up on is how are the tools of the future starting to integrate systems that normally would be bespoke? And again, this doesn't just apply to the CRM, it applies to lots of different tools. Are they incorporating composable components of outside tools to make your life easier? Integration with other tools is obviously really important. We talked about this in the Frick framework around operability. So I won't dwell too much on there, but again, I think this is like in the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, this is like the third or fourth need. And then you have data federation, collection, audience segmentation, reporting, analytics, attribution. I would say the moment in time where this stuff becomes really important is when people start to feel the flywheel of their go-to-market motion working. And so I share all this because there will be some of you who go to startups and start the revenue technology stack. And I would argue like reporting, analytics, even attribution, which we're going to talk about with Pranav. Actually, Pranav, I'll use your own advice. It was like, when I think you had this on your podcast with the MarTech folks, Humans of MarTech, you're like, no, nobody cares about attribution when you only have like 10 to 100 leads. It's like, it's such a high level need to solve. And yet I think as a systems operator, it's the instinct to go solving this problem long before you actually need to. And I don't want to steal any of the thunder of your conversation later. My own experience has been like so much energy and time is put into attribution and tracking long before it's ever needed. And actually the best thing you need for much of a company's life cycle is directional based attribution. Anyways, you can chime in if you want briefly, Pranav, or I can save it for later.
My reaction is the heart emoji, and then we'll dive in later. Totally with you.
Okay, great. I love it. I love it. So let's unpack this a bit. I previously talked about schema as these columns inside an Excel sheet. I want to come back to this because I think that object orientation and understanding how objects work and how we define certain terms in a CRM and a CDP are actually really important. There's a technical basis to this. And I'll just leave you guys by saying, if any of this doesn't make sense, you should talk to GPT about these things and start to learn yourself. I made the argument for a number of years that the best Rev and Martech people were actually like engineers in disguise. So I think like if there's one takeaway, from this section and this lesson in particular, it's that we all are going to be challenged to be more technical than maybe we thought we could be or ever would be. So real quick, an object is, you can think of it as a digital filing cabinet, or if you're in an Excel sheet, you could think of it as a tab. It's a way of structuring data. You're familiar with objects, even if you don't know it. A contact, an account, an opportunity, these are all ideas of objects. And in a CRM like HubSpot and others, you can create a custom object. So if your business is bespoke, you could make some other entity to describe something for your business. The example I always like to go to is my cousins own a real estate business, and they have, in their CRM, they've literally built, a property object, which defines a physical location, right? That doesn't fit into any of these other things. We have this thing called a lead object, though. And a lead object is also a contact, but it's not. And in some CRMs, it behaves a particular way. In other CRMs, it doesn't. And so people always ask the question, do I need a lead object? Why? I want to talk about this, but just for the sake of time, because I was told very aggressively that I have to end in 2 minutes. I'm gonna come back to this question in a second. But before we come back to the lead question, every object has fields or attributes or properties. These are all the same words for the exact same thing. So whether you have a user object or a person object or a contact object, they're going to have these things called properties. Properties can be attributes. Attributes can be called fields. You guys are all familiar with this by now. And every single object inside the CRM has these, whether it's custom events or attributes or fields or pipeline stages or relationships. They all have fields or attributes or properties related to them. And I think one of the most important reasons why I talk about this is because this is the same nomenclature, whether you're talking about MarTech or RevTech. In MarTech land and a CDP, it's users with properties and events with event properties or event fields or event attributes. It's all the same language. I get this question enough that I felt like it was important to talk about it. Last, on the site, we obviously have a bunch of different resources for you to look at different CRMs. And I think if there's one thing to take away from this part of the lecture so far, it's that in the early days, when you first go to set up your technology stack, keeping things simple is kind of the key. So focus on the critical capabilities that you need: opportunity tracking, pipeline management. As you progress up the complexity value chain, you will also then noticing the capabilities that you need become more advanced, and that might then evoke the need for you to look at different tooling. For example, integration with other tools. Can't tell you how many times people focus on that in the pre-product market fit stage, long before they've even earned the right to kind of worry about those integration. So yeah, if there's one takeaway from all this, it's that think about your company's size, life cycle, where you are, where you're going in your tooling decisions, and think about what you might need in the next phase or two. Don't too aggressively try to anchor towards the scale form, which is what everybody tends to do. We're going to flip it over for QA and then get into it with Pranav. But before we do that, we have this really fun slide that I wanted to share before, but now since we have a minute for it, we can talk about it, which is this idea of, should you create a lead or not create a lead? And I'd love to hear from one person who feels very strongly that you have the lead inside of a CRM, and for very good reason. And I'd love to hear from a person who thinks you don't need a lead, if there's anybody here that doesn't believe you need a lead object. No takers. Nobody has strong opinions. I know there's some strong opinions. Yeah,
Type.
tell me.
I inherit our CRM. I'm not a big fan of lead object because it causes a lot of confusion. I'm doing enablement too, but I
Hmm.
can see it has a value in the way the structure is that a lead for us is something that comes and finds us and is not really it's not validated at that point, and it is not fully, it's not related in our CRM yet to an account record. It's a company name that's been typed in. So
Hmm.
someone in our sales organization have to make a conscious decision that this lead person is worth including in our CRM as a contact when they now go into the full database relationship.
Hmm.
So I'm not a big fan of it, but I can still see a purpose of why someone before me set it up. And I have left it and we have continued with it because that's also what our sales team has been used to. So I'm okay with it. I do know that our HubSpot does not have it, and I will say that caused some confusion because of that. So I guess
Love it.
I'm kind of in between, and I see a lot of hands, so I'm curious to hear from others.
Okay, I want to leave this for QA. I'll ask one other person. How about Marco, you want to share, and then we'll come back to this at the end.
Yes, I was thinking that it could be useful to tell sales that they are only supposed to reach out to leads, for example, not to reach out to contacts. Um, I can speak about the things we do internally, but I find that useful because for certain companies and type of leads, there are more efficient ways to go about them, and not always you want to have a human interacting with people. So that could be a way. You tell sales you only deal with leads, and we define leads in a certain way, and then anything else, you don't need to worry about that, and the company does other things with contacts.
I love the sharing. We're gonna come back. I have some strong thoughts, and I know like at least three other people do, and Pranav does, which is I probably should have left 5 whole minutes for this slide, which is the reason why it's so great. But I want to leave plenty of time for Pranav to talk about marketing attribution. So Pranav, I'm gonna hand it over to you and clear the floor for you to tell us about why we should care about attribution, when, why, and how.
Yeah, no, that's I learned some stuff in the first half an hour, Austin. So thank you. And maybe the right starting point is to talk about leads. And the reason I say that is, some of the things Anne you mentioned and Marco you mentioned, this idea of delineating between what came inbound and raise their hands, but they're not validated yet, and should sales reach out to them or not, right? These are all sort of concepts that somehow also get covered in the attribution topic. My sort of thought on this whole lead business is the reason for the confusion is quite simple. It's when your entire go-to-market motion is a little bit opaque. And what I mean by opaque is your pricing is in public. It's not obvious who your product is built for. It's not obvious what are the capabilities of your product. When you have those types of issues in how transparent your product is or your offering is, then this concept of qualification comes in. Oh, I have to qualify you before I can put you in front of sales. Otherwise, you're wasting your time and sales is wasting their time. But imagine a world where your entire product value prop pricing was a lot more transparent. And then anybody who's raising their hands and saying, hey, I want a demo of product X, Y, and Z, or I want to start a trial, it's qualified by default because you're
Mhm.
not hiding anything from them and then sort of forcing them to go through some buying process that you think is the right process, right? Customers or prospects should be qualifying us rather than us qualifying them. When you take that sort of perspective, I think the conversation about leads to me kind of disappears. It doesn't have that much value, but that's my personal take. I'm sure there are counter arguments to that. But Austin, I wanted to start there. I don't know if you have any follow up thoughts on that framing.
Yeah, I'll keep it brief because there's something admin related to slides that I can't forget. But I agree, and I actually think this is a great tie-in for history. I told everybody about how Salesforce was invented back in 1999 and the common database structure of Salesforce back at the time. And I'm not trying to be overly pedantic about Salesforce. There's a reason we focus on these things because they kind of invented the common nomenclature that we're all talking about now. Why did a lead object exist in 1997 or 1999 or 2005? That's the real question to ask. Well, it existed back then because it was hard to manage data back in 2005. Contacts were supposed to be people that the company had real relationships with that were tracked over time. It was a data quality problem. So the lead object was your garbage dumpster. It was like, hey, all the shit that comes into the company is a lead. And then people have to manually convert that lead into a contact. You have a sales rep who's physically looking at the leads and qualifying them and then converting them into a contact if it's a real, genuine qualified account. And if it's not, it's getting dumped into I don't know, some type of sales list or forgotten. And that was how they separated structured and unstructured data. Unstructured lead data was a lead, structured contact data was contacts. But we're living in a different world here, right? You just pointed this out. You have the ability now to qualify somebody instantly. The lead object is just an artifact from a different time when it was hard to do this. So I would argue if you have the ability to manage your contact database elegantly inside of the CRM or the warehouse, it doesn't matter whether you use a lead object or a lead field on a contact object. They're the exact same outcome. This is all why history matters. Understanding why tools were designed the way they were is an important lesson in this course, because you'll come across tools that are 10, 15 years old, and you may look at it and be like, oh, this is dumb. Like, why is it designed this way? And it's usually because of some reason. If you understand the reason, then you can start to think about, okay, well, I acknowledge that reason, but now what am I going to do about it? How am I going to change my system? And I'm sure this gets to attribution around, right? Where I get all my shit in the warehouse, so I can just do what I want. I do want to hand it over to you, though. I want to hear your slides. I wanted to ask the question of Pranav. Do you want to share your screen with your slides? You don't want me to walk through and you can just tell me when to click?
Yeah, you can go to the next slide and it'll be easier. Otherwise, I'm fiddling through my stuff here. Okay, so let's talk about attribution. It's the most spicy topic when it comes to marketing, at least. Or, if you have worked with marketing ops, marketing analytics, or revenue ops, revenue analytics people, like this is definitely a thorny issue. The first thing that I like to talk about is what are we even defining attribution as? And there's multiple, if you just open up a dictionary and look at the word attribution, what does it mean? There's multiple different definitions. But when it comes to the overarching question that business leaders are trying to answer, it's all about identifying the cause and effect relationship between any marketing or sales strategy and your business outcomes. Ultimately, that is the question that you're trying to answer. What should I do to grow my business and do it in a predictable way, right? If I spend more money on X strategy, it's going to get me Y, additional demos or pipeline or whatever. So that's what attribution is typically sort of defined as, even if it's, people might not sort of say that out loud and may have different ways of defining it within their tech stack, but that's the $1 million question that your CFO, your CMO, your CEO care about. If you go to the next slide, Austin, there are a few different ways in which people do this work. How do you do attribution, right? So we talked about what it is. The first and the most primary methodology that people use is this idea of, touches or tracking sort of, clicks. You might have heard things like first touch, last touch, multi-touch. And what's really fascinating is that there's been a lot of work in this space in the last 2 decades. If you have worked with Google Analytics, you'll hear about data-driven attribution. If you go into Meta ads or LinkedIn ads, you will see attribution windows and attribution methodology. They're all based on these touch-based sort of models. And what's fascinating to me is that there's neither correlation nor causation in these models, but they have become sort of the de facto methodology. And so there's something that you all should sort of dig into and really sort of understand, why this happened. And we won't go through all of the history of it, but just know that when you hear first touch, last touch, multi-touch, it's more about the behavior and the journey rather than the cause and effect relationship. And there's value in understanding that journey, but it's not really answering the question of attribution the way that you would ideally want to answer it. If you go to the next one, Austin, there are, other methodologies that have existed. And historically, they have not been available to brands of all sizes or businesses of all sizes. So there's this thing called marketing mix modeling. Some people call it media mix modeling. There are some differences and nuances, but MMM for short. And this is a statistical methodology that figures out the relationship between all of your marketing investments and your business outcomes. And now in a B2B context, you can also use this for sales investments. Like if you have a bunch of BDRs or SDRs doing outbound or what have you, you can understand the relationship between those activities and your business outcomes. This is a correlational methodology. It involves some fairly sort of nuanced sort of statistics and econometrics, and you're able to get an estimate of your cause and effect. And so this is making a massive comeback. This methodology started in the consumer space, in the CPG space from companies like P&G back in the 80s and 90s, but making a massive comeback now through all the machine learning stuff that's happening. And then the last piece, if you go to the next one, Austin, is this concept of incrementality testing. Sounds like a very fancy sort of word, but it's basically saying if you could run an A/B test in the real world, essentially apply this marketing or sales strategy to just one part of your audience, and then have a control where you do not apply that strategy to that audience. And you see, are you able to move up your demos or your pipeline in that test versus control? And now you get to true causality, right? You can actually run an experiment and observe the incremental impact that your strategy had. So zooming out, those are the 3 or 4 different methodologies to measure attribution. And when you say the word attribution, people are going to have different ways of interpreting what that means. So get really crisp and clear when you are working with your revenue teams, with your marketing teams, with your systems. What are you really talking about? Are you talking about sort of tracking the journey and the behavioral analytics like we talked about with touch-based? Are you talking about sort of the correlational methodology with MMM? Are you talking about true causality with incrementality? And again, to echo Austin's point, you don't have to get to perfect on step 1 as you're just getting started and setting up the systems. But knowing these concepts will help you make sure that you're eventually getting to the gold standard, which is having things like incrementality and MMM. Okay. Let's keep going to the next slide. I'm also reading Shai, your point. One cynical point of view, these no correlation attribution models are an attempt to make it easy to understand for CEOs. They have become about justifying budget rather than understanding what's working. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. But I would also say, Shai, it's not just about sort of making it easy to understand for the CEOs. I think as an industry, if you think about marketing leadership or sales leadership in a scaling business, they don't typically come from a statistical background, right? They may have never studied statistics. They may have never really understood what correlation or causation even means. We all throw out those words as if we understand them, but they actually have some meaning. So it's not just about sort of doing something that's easy to understand. It's also just marketing leadership or sales leadership just may not have the context. And so go and with all the AI stuff that's available to us now, you feed in any of those terms onto ChatGPT or Claude, you should be able to come up to speed fairly quickly on what they mean, how they work, and so on and so forth. Okay.
And Pranav, one thing I want to add too, just because I love this point, it's totally not just to appease CEOs, in my opinion. At Ramp, we had a very smart, highly engaged and intellectual CEO. And I will tell you what, like, we probably would have been better off just using a last touch attribution model. You know, running $100 million marketing budget. You're asking yourself why. And it has to do with the fact that at some point, it becomes very challenging to track all the things that would lead to either direct attribution or even non-deterministic, probabilistic attribution. And, obviously, like, I'm a big fan of Pete Fader, and we've talked about this a lot, but it's like, at some point, if you can't measure or understand enough to know what's good, then actually sometimes a simple model is better than a more complex model. Not to say that, big companies should be doing that, but the idea that sometimes you should be changing your attribution just to appease the CEO ignores the fact that sometimes the CEO's pointer is right, which is like, this is way too complex. How do you know this is real? Anyways, just wanted to point that out.
No, it's a great point, and the word model is interesting, right? The word model itself tells you that that's not reality. It's a model of reality, and all models are going to be wrong to some degree. Some are going to be less wrong than others, and you're essentially just trying to find the least wrong model. Now, for most of you, I imagine you're just kind of getting started with your RevTech stack or your MarTech stack, and the core things that you have to remember on this journey are here on this page, right? So let's start with the first point. If you go to the next slide, Austin, there's a build up here. We talk about starting with a very clear metric, and we overcomplicate this in SaaS and B2B businesses. We've got MQLs, and we've got stage one opportunities, and we've got qualified pipe, and we've got closed won revenue, and we're trying to hold our marketing teams or our sales teams accountable to every single one of those metrics. Not going to happen. Keep it super simple. And that's number one. What is that key metric that you're going to hold your marketing budget accountable to, or your sales metric accountable, sales investments accountable to, whatever that might be? I love the idea of hand raisers, demo bookings, trial starts, things that are explicit and clear from a prospect's perspective, that is a sign of true engagement with your product or with your business. So that's one. Start with one very clear sort of conversion metric that you're going to track. If you go to the next slide, this idea of not over-engineering and keeping things super simple, I think is also critical. There's a ton of tools. If you haven't seen things like Google Analytics 4, Mixpanel, Amplitude, now you've got Ahrefs jumping in here. They've got a tool. There's a bunch of like free privacy-centric analytics tools. Use any of them. They're all pretty good, and they'll give you a good sense of all the things that are happening on your website. And again, this is all about sort of understanding what's happening, not why, but you got to start with the what before you can get to the why. And this last piece is really important. You've got to be able to have some amount of geo-tracking. And this means, if you're looking at book a demo as your key metric and you're using, Mixpanel to track that, you've got a geo tag against every book a demo. And so now you can start to say, I've got 5 demos coming from California, 10 demos from New York, 7 from Texas, and so on and so forth. And I'll explain why this is important when we start to get to experimentation, because that data literally will feed into your experimentation planning. So keep it super simple. I see a question here. How do you feel about using pipeline dollars as that one metric? Yeah, I mean, it kind of depends if you have a lot of variation in your audience. If you sell into SMB and mid-market and enterprise, and your pipeline dollar value for the same demo could be $10,000 or $500,000, yeah, you have some issues to deal with. But I would argue when you're starting off, hopefully your business is not that complicated. You have your ICP nailed in, and you're going after a much more predictable sort of motion, right? So that type of complexity comes in when you really have multi-segment type of businesses. So I don't know. I don't have a strong opinion, but it kind of depends on the nuance of your business. And then you have this question of, is sales qualified opportunities conversion instead of MQLs or SAL, sales accepted leads, to down funnel as a North Star metric? great question about this, latency latency versus effective leading indicator. As much as possible, Jihan, I would say you want to pick a metric that responds fairly quickly to the stimulus, right? So if you make a marketing investment and it takes 6 months for that to show up as a sales qualified opportunity, you're doing yourself a disservice by picking a down funnel metric. So really understand what that buying cycle, consideration cycle is, and find a metric that is close enough, but is also truly a leading indicator. And you can go and use some basic sort of Excel math to figure out if that's the case or not. Okay, so you started with one metric, you got that instrumentation done. Step number 1, this is something that you all can do tomorrow. DIY holdout tests. So do it yourself holdout tests. You don't need any fancy software. You can do this with any marketing channel, any sales strategy that you want to put out there. Well, most of them, at least from a paid perspective. So how does it work? You remember we talked about this idea of collecting geo data for every output metric that we are tracking, right? So you now know how many demos are coming from California, Texas, New York, and so on and so forth. You've mapped this across all of the US. Now, let's say your team comes up with this brilliant idea that, hey, we should do some LinkedIn advertising. And we're feeling good, we're gonna invest $50,000. Instead of taking that money and spending it or peanut buttering it across the entire country, you take that and you invest it in one specific geography. Let's say you pick California, and you're going to look at now, do your demos go up from California relative to Texas and New York, where you have the control? You don't need fancy statistical sort of algorithms for this. You can literally just eyeball your trend lines from California, from Texas, from New York, and you see where you're able to create an inflection point as a result of your LinkedIn dollars. And why am I saying this? Because marketing does not work in a linear fashion. Sales does not work in a linear fashion. It's very possible that somebody sees your LinkedIn ad, never clicks on it. 2 days later, they go directly to your website, type it out in the URL, book a demo. That's what goes missing from behavioral analytics or the touch-based attribution world. So doing these experiments in this fashion helps you cut across those types of issues, and you can go straight to a cause and effect relationship. So that's what the best companies in the world are doing. They're doing it with lots of data science, and it gets a little bit more complicated when you have LinkedIn and YouTube and Google and TV and direct mail and SDRs all running in parallel. But when you're starting out and you're experimenting with one thing, this is a great way to prove incrementality in the early days of your journey. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And if you have questions, please feel free to add them. Growth spend. So now you've got a few different tests. You've proven that LinkedIn advertising is working. Maybe you did the same thing for YouTube in a different state. You're able to prove YouTube advertising is working, so on and so forth. You've reached a point where you're now spending $200K, $300K, $400K a month. You have multiple channels running at the same time. And suddenly experimentation becomes a little bit costly because you proved incrementality, you rolled it out nationally. Now every new experiment becomes a little bit more complicated as you start to grow. The math isn't as easy to do by just eyeballing the data. And that's where things like MMM come up. So this is when you're starting to hit that $2 million, $3 million, $4 million a year type of mark, and you set up things like marketing mix modeling, or you go and get a vendor for more sort of sophisticated incrementality testing. Some names are here on the screen, and why are you doing this? You're doing this because you don't have time to waste. You've hit product market fit. You're reliably able to spend and deploy a whole bunch of dollars. And guess what? You don't have to go hire data scientists to do this yourself. There are solutions anywhere from $5K a month all the way to $20K a month that'll help you do this type of stuff. You just have to go look for those types of solutions. Now, to Austin's point, right? Do you need this? Is it a must-have? It's not if you have a very good internal culture and process for doing experimentation. This stuff is helpful, especially when you have, I would argue, a very complicated business. You've got lots of sort of differing opinions about where to invest your dollars, and you're trying to break through that noise. It is possible when you have an amazing business like a Ramp, or I will take an example like Dropbox from my early days, where the product-led growth and the virality and the brand is just so massive that they did not need stuff like this until much later in life, right? Ramp is now investing in incrementality testing in a more sort of sophisticated fashion. I was catching up with the team there, Austin, just a couple of months ago. So they're making some investments there. So for every business, it's going to be a different time when you go into this, growth spend and graduating to that sort of level of specificity. Okay, moving to the next slide. The multi-touch myth. I get a lot of hate for this on LinkedIn, so I will say this right off the bat. I don't think that it makes a ton of sense for people to go down this path of building very sophisticated multi-touch attribution models. And the reason for that is, by definition, you exclude a whole bunch of channels, because those channels influence your audience without generating a touch. And video is a great example of this. Paid social is a great example of this. Think about your own buying behavior or your media consumption habits. How often do you click on a YouTube ad? How often do you click on a paid social ad? How often do you remember the code from a podcast when they have, hey, go to xyz.com/20% off, right? We all don't operate that way. And so the whole premise behind multi-touch attribution is problematic. And when you have things like incrementality testing and MMM, it's a much easier way to spend or analyze the incremental sort of results from your investments. And that's a better use of your time and money. So that's what I would say. Last couple of points here before we wrap. So there's also this fascination with trying to hold everything accountable for every part of the funnel and journey. And I don't think that that's necessarily helpful. What you ought to do is understand what is the primary metric that you are holding your marketing team accountable to and your sales team accountable to. And those might be different metrics. Sales might all be about converting the pipeline that's being generated by marketing. And maybe your product-led growth team is responsible for the 30-day retention or the renewal rates or what have you. And so be very crisp and clear about the metric for each part of the buyer journey and who is ultimately sort of responsible for that metric, and have a different way of testing the attribution towards that metric based on sort of the strategy that you have. Last slide. Okay, this one does a pretty good job in just kind of laying out how you should think about the maturity going from early stage all the way to scale. And my recommendation for all of you, I have to assume that most of you are in that post PMF stage, the first sort of level of scale, is doing these types of DIY incrementality tests, holdout tests, geo tests. And you don't need a ton of software to be able to do that. As you go from that to growth and to scale, you're looking at incrementality testing tools, you're looking at marketing mix modeling tools, and starting to kind of layer on the more sophisticated ways of doing things. If you have the benefit of hiring dedicated data scientists for your marketing team, even better. That gives you a lot more control about how you architect your internal efforts around this. But if you don't have that benefit, then using off-the-shelf tools is not a bad idea. There's also a bunch of, I would say, open source tools. So if you have a strong sort of marketing analyst, Google, Meta, and some other open source sort of packages have shown up for both MMM and incrementality testing that are pretty good, I would say, to get you off to the races. So that's all we have. With 4 minutes left, questions? All right. Can you share some examples in choosing North Star metrics for revenue in early days? How often does it change during growth stages? I'll tell you what we did. We are an early stage company, 25 customers. We sell into the enterprise. Our metric is demos booked. That's all that matters. And our demo booking is on our website. We can self-schedule it. It's very clear and easy. Our pricing is public. Our value prop is public. And that's the metric that we manage both our sales and marketing efforts to. We do have internal metrics that translate from demos to pipeline and dollars of pipeline, but we have a pretty predictable way of figuring out what that's going to be like. Austin, what do you all do for Clarify?
I mean, the number one indicator of success is SQL, what we call SQL pipeline. We just started tracking this. SQL pipeline is a reflection of a multiplier of the amount of pipeline you need to close in the quarter. So say your business wants to earn $50,000 in a quarter. You need to have $150,000 to $200,000 in SQL pipeline to be reasonably confident that you can close that 50K in pipeline. And this was a metric used at Ramp. It was probably the only one that mattered, was how much SQL pipeline do you have? How much dollars do you have that you're tracking towards? Now, what I would share though is it's very easy to misconstrue as a vanity metric. So I see people, especially startups, flaunting how much dollar pipeline they created. Well, you can make all the pipeline in the world, but if you can't close the pipeline, you're kind of screwed. So for us, care a lot about SQL pipeline, but we care also just as much about what is our close to conversion rate. What's the rate from generating that SQL to closing? And the reason we're focusing on this right now, to just be really transparent, is we actually maybe for the last month, we were very fixated on MQLs because there was a clear lineage between MQL and $1. But we're trying new pricing. And when you try new pricing, all your assumptions about how you get to your revenue target for the year change. So because we don't really know with certainty how many leads we'll need, that's not a very useful thing to treat as our top line metric number. Instead, we actually only care right now about SQL pipeline generated because we have some conviction that, hey, if we're generating 2, 3, 4x the amount of pipeline that we need to close with, we'd have to be really bad at sales to not close our dollar amount. So, I mean, I think maybe the punchline though, Pranav, that you're indicating is a lot of times there's no silver bullet. This requires human thought. You have to be thoughtful about what you're tracking and why. And I think another question was does it change? And the answer is absolutely yes. In pre and post market fit, these things will change all the time. And then I think as you approach growth and certainly scale, they become more dialed in, not only because you have the resources to track everything you would need to make these calculations, but because your business matures and you kind of have a repeatable motion in place.
Great point, Austin. I know we are at time. I can go on for maybe another minute here to answer a couple of questions here. So if MTA tools are in essence wrong and not recommended, why is this category tool still growing? Listen, there is
love it.
It's a great question. People love, if I were to tell you all, hey, here's a JavaScript tag, put it on your website, click, 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 you're off the races, and you've got amazing, pretty charts and dashboards, and they tell you everything you need to know. Why wouldn't you just go pay $100 a month to go do that, right? So what I'm trying to say is they may be wrong, but they make it very easy for you to believe that they are right. And if you apply, and this is true for most software, right? How many times have you all heard, take this course, it's going to make you a millionaire, right? Take this pill, it's going to make you, until Ozempic came, lose you lots of weight, right? So there's a lot of stuff that's sold online. Do your own research on what is happening with the actual data. And especially if you're coming to this course, right, you've already sort of started to scratch that surface. and do your own research and figure out for yourself. Maybe I'm wrong, right? Maybe Pranav is mistaken, and indeed tools like Hockey Stack are fantastic, right? So do your own research is what I would say. Last thing, duration of testing, at least 4 weeks is typically what I recommend. And you got to do the math to know, are you investing enough? And the math is quite simple. What is the target lift that you are expecting? What is the cost per incremental conversion? That gives you the budget that you have to test with, right? And so it's fairly trivial to at least sort of get started with incrementality testing. But if you care about more of this, please, follow along on LinkedIn. You can find me there and DM me, and happy to be of help.
Thank you so much for making the time. Thank you, class, for coming again and bringing your attention and great questions. We will see you on Wednesday with Kiki Burton.
Thank you.
See you all.
See
Thank
y'all.
you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.